There's nothing quite like the bond between a man and his dog, especially when that dog becomes your only companion after 50 years of marriage ends in heartbreak. For 70-year-old mountain man Caleb Rowen, his faithful dog Buck wasn't just a hunting partner. He was the last connection to a life that once had meaning. They lived simply in Montana's wilderness, hunting for food and finding peace in the quiet mountains. But one morning, they tracked a wounded deer and found something that would change everything. The animal had a massive, strange lump growing from its side. When Caleb cut it open, what came out wasn't disease or infection. It was something that knew his name and remembered his darkest secrets from decades past. What had this old mountain man done years ago that would come back to haunt him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn crept through the pine boughs like fingers searching for something lost, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn logs of Caleb Rowen's cabin. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed, working his arthritic fingers around the chain that hung from his neck, Martha's wedding ring catching the pale morning light. 53 years they'd been married when the cancer took her, and in the 2 years since, this simple gold band had become his morning ritual, his evening prayer, his constant reminder that some loves don't end with death. Buck, a grizzled German shepherd mix with more grey than brown in his muzzle, lifted his head from his worn blanket near the stone fireplace. The dog's dark eyes held an intelligence that had kept Caleb sane through the darkest months after Martha's passing. Buck wasn't just a companion. He was the last living thing that remembered Martha's laugh, her gentle hands scratching behind his ears, her voice calling them both in for supper. "Morning, old boy," Caleb whispered, his voice gravelly from years of mountain air and too much solitude. Buck's tail thumped twice against the floor, their daily acknowledgement that they'd both survived another night of dreams and memories. The cabin hadn't changed much since Martha died. Her coffee mug still sat in the dish drain, washed but never put away. Her reading glasses remained on the kitchen table next to a book she'd never finish. Caleb had tried moving things, tried making the space his own, but every change felt like betrayal. So he lived around her absence, navigating the spaces between what was and what used to be. Outside, the Bitterroot Range stretched endlessly in all directions, a wilderness so vast and unforgiving that a man could disappear into it and never be found. Caleb had come here 35 years ago with Martha, drawn by work with the logging company and seduced by the promise of a simple life away from the complications of civilization. Back then, he'd been foreman for Mountain Creek Timber, overseeing crews that carved roads through virgin forest and brought down trees older than the nation itself. Those had been good years mostly. The work was honest and hard, the kind that left a man tired in his bones but satisfied in his soul. The company paid well, and Caleb had earned respect among the loggers for his fair dealing and willingness to work alongside any man under his command. He and Martha had built this cabin with their own hands, cutting the logs from trees he'd felled himself, chinking the gaps with mud and moss, creating something that would last. But even good years have their shadows, and Caleb's past carried secrets that had grown heavier with time. There were things the company had asked him to do, things that seemed reasonable then, but tasted bitter now in memory. Corners cut, regulations bent, decisions made in the name of efficiency that had consequences he was only beginning to understand. The sound of Buck's claws on the wooden floor pulled Caleb from his brooding. The dog was standing by the door, that particular patience in his posture that meant he was ready for their morning routine. Caleb rose stiffly, joints protesting the cold mountain air that seeped through even the tightest chinks. At 70, his body was a catalogue of old injuries and accumulated wear, a back that ached from decades of heavy lifting, knees that predicted weather changes, hands scarred by saw blades and splinters. He pulled on his heavy wool jacket, the same one he'd worn for 20 years, patched and repatched, but still warm. Martha had insisted on buying him a new one the last Christmas they'd shared, but it still hung in the closet with the tags attached. Some things weren't meant to be replaced. The morning air bit at his cheeks as he stepped onto the porch, Buck already ranging ahead to check the perimeter of their small clearing. The dog had developed habits since Martha's death, protective instincts that sometimes worried Caleb. Buck would circle the cabin twice each morning and evening, nose to the ground, alert to changes that might threaten their small world. Caleb's nearest neighbor was Pete Granger, a man even older than himself, who lived 5 miles down the mountain in a trailer surrounded by the accumulated debris of a long life. Pete had been a mechanic before his retirement, and his property looked like a graveyard for every vehicle that had ever broken down within 50 miles. But Pete was good company when the silence got too thick, and his granddaughter Sarah visited often enough to keep both old men connected to the world beyond the mountains. Sarah. Granger was something else entirely, 35 years old with her grandmother's sharp wit and her own fierce intelligence. She'd earned a doctorate in environmental science from the University of Montana and worked for the state monitoring water quality and ecosystem health. She worried about her grandfather living alone, just as she worried about Caleb, though she was too polite to say so directly. Instead, she'd arrive unannounced with fresh bread or news from town, staying just long enough to assure herself that both old men were eating properly and maintaining some connection to sanity. Caleb appreciated her visits more than he let on. Sarah reminded him of Martha in small ways, the way she listened completely when someone spoke, the gentle insistence on helping without making it feel like charity. She'd been the one to convince him to keep Buck after Martha died, arguing that the dog needed him as much as he needed the dog. She'd been right, as she usually was about such things. The morning hunt was ritual now, one of the few things that gave structure to Caleb's days. He and Buck would range through the forest, sometimes bringing back a rabbit or grouse for dinner, sometimes returning empty-handed, but satisfied by the simple act of moving through the wilderness together. Martha had never much cared for hunting, but she'd understood his need for it, the way it connected him to something primal and honest. Something that existed outside the complicated mess of human civilization. Today felt different, though. Buck seemed more alert than usual, pausing frequently to test the air with his nose, his ears pricked forward in a way that suggested something had changed in their familiar territory. Caleb trusted the dog's instincts completely. Buck had alerted him to bears twice and a mountain lion once, potentially saving both their lives. They followed a game trail that wound through a grove of aspens, their leaves already turning the pale yellow that announced autumn's arrival. The trail showed signs of recent deer activity, fresh tracks in the soft earth, broken twigs at browsing height, the musky scent that meant a herd had passed through within the last day or two. But there was something else, something that made Buck's hackles rise slightly as they moved deeper into the trees. The forest felt different, quieter than usual, as if the smaller creatures had found somewhere else to be. Even the birds seemed subdued, their usual morning chatter reduced to occasional nervous chirps. Caleb had learned to pay attention to such signs. The wilderness had its own language, and a man who ignored its warnings didn't last long in country this remote. Martha used to tease him about his mountain sense, but she'd also trusted it completely. When Caleb said they needed to get off the ridge before the weather turned, she never questioned his judgment. As they crested a small rise, Buck suddenly froze, one paw raised, his body rigid with attention. Ahead, through a gap in the trees, something large lay motionless in a small clearing. Caleb approached carefully, one hand resting on the rifle slung across his shoulder, though he doubted he'd need it. The deer was a mature buck, his antlers spreading wide enough to indicate several years of successful survival in these unforgiving mountains. But something was wrong with the animal, terribly wrong. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the massive growth protruding from the deer's side, a grotesque lump the size of a small watermelon that pulsed with its own rhythm. Buck whined softly, a sound Caleb had never heard from the usually stoic dog. The German shepherd refused to approach closer, instead backing away with his tail low and his ears flat against his head. Whatever this was, Buck's instincts were screaming danger. Caleb knelt beside the wounded animal, his experienced eye taking in the labored breathing, the glazed look of pain and exhaustion in the deer's dark eyes. This was an animal at the end of its suffering, and Caleb had seen enough of death to recognize when mercy was the only gift left to give. But the lump, that was something else entirely. It seemed almost alive, the surface moving slightly as if something inside was trying to escape. The skin around it was discolored, shot through with dark veins that looked more like ink than blood. This wasn't any disease Caleb had encountered in 35 years of mountain living. He drew his hunting knife, the blade sharp enough to shave with, worn smooth from decades of use. Martha had given him this knife for their 10th wedding anniversary, the handle carved from elk antler and inscribed with his initials. It had dressed hundreds of animals over the years, had saved his life more than once, had become as much a part of him as his own hands. The deer's eyes found his as he positioned the blade, and Caleb saw something there that chilled him, not just pain, but recognition, as if the animal knew him, had been waiting for him specifically, which was impossible, of course. The dying mind often played tricks, saw patterns where none existed. "Easy now," he whispered, the same words he'd spoken to countless wounded animals over the years. "It's almost over." The cut was clean and quick, ending the deer's suffering in an instant. But as the animal's breathing stopped, the lump seemed to pulse harder, as if responding to the host's death with some desperate urgency of its own. Against every instinct screaming at him to walk away, Caleb positioned his knife over the grotesque growth. Martha had always said his curiosity would be the death of him, and maybe she'd been right. But a lifetime of solving problems had taught him that understanding was always better than ignorance. Even when the truth was ugly, the blade sliced through the diseased skin easily, too easily, and what spilled out onto the forest floor wasn't blood or pus or any natural corruption. It was something else entirely, a dark, viscous substance that seemed to move with purpose, forming shapes that almost looked like symbols before dissolving back into formless ooze. And in the center of it all, gleaming like an accusation, was a small piece of metal stamped with numbers and letters Caleb recognized. A identification tag from Mountain Creek Timber, the company he'd worked for until his retirement 15 years ago. A company that had asked him to do things, terrible things, that he'd spent years trying to forget. Buck's terrified howl echoed through the suddenly silent forest, and Caleb realized that his past hadn't died with Martha's forgiveness. It had been waiting out here in the wilderness, growing and changing and preparing to come home. The Mountain Creek Timber identification tag lay in Caleb's palm, like a fragment of a life he'd thought was buried. The metal was corroded, discolored by whatever foul chemistry had been growing inside that deer, but the numbers were still legible, MCT 1987-047. He knew that designation system by heart. It was from the year he'd been promoted to senior foreman, when the company had started asking him to oversee special projects that didn't appear on any official paperwork. Buck remained at the edge of the clearing, whining and pacing, but refusing to come closer. In 30 years of hunting together, first with Martha and then alone, Caleb had never seen the dog display such fear. Buck had faced down bears with more courage than he was showing now, and that fact settled into Caleb's stomach like a cold stone. The dark substance that had spilled from the deer's growth was changing, spreading across the forest floor in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Not because they were bright or sharp, but because they seemed to twist in ways that made his eyes water and his head ache. Shapes that almost formed letters, symbols that felt familiar but wrong, like words from a language he'd once known but had tried desperately to forget. Caleb pulled out his old compass, a military-issue instrument he'd carried since Vietnam. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, jerking back and forth as if the very earth beneath his feet had become unreliable. That was impossible. The Bitterroot Range was solid granite and basalt, about as magnetically stable as any place on Earth. Yet the compass needle danced like a thing possessed, finally settling on a bearing that pointed directly at the spreading dark mass. "What in hell?" Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible above Buck's increasingly agitated whimpering. He'd seen strange things in these mountains over the years. Wildlife behaving oddly after harsh winters. Trees growing in unnatural patterns where lightning had struck repeatedly. Even the occasional atmospheric phenomenon that made the aurora borealis visible this far south. But this was different. This felt intentional, directed, as if something with intelligence was announcing its presence. The identification tag grew warm in his hand, then hot enough that he nearly dropped it. When he looked down, the corroded metal was clearing, the numbers becoming sharper, more distinct. And underneath the designation he'd recognized, other markings were becoming visible, symbols that made his chest tighten with recognition and dread. Project Deepwood. The name hit him like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd spent 15 years trying to suppress. Late-night conversations with company executives who wore expensive suits to job sites where no suit belonged. Shipments that arrived under military escort and disappeared into the deepest parts of the forest. Disposal sites that weren't marked on any map. Locations that only he and a handful of other senior employees were trusted to know. Martha had asked him about those years, sensing the weight they'd added to his shoulders. The way he'd wake sometimes in the middle of the night with his hands shaking. But he'd never told her the full truth. Some burdens were too heavy to share, even with the woman who'd promised to love him through everything. The dark substance had stopped spreading, settling into a rough circle about 10 feet across. Within that circle, the very air seemed different, thicker somehow, with an oily quality that made breathing uncomfortable. The autumn leaves that had fallen into the contaminated area were dissolving, not rotting in any natural way, but simply ceasing to exist as if they'd never been. Buck's whining had evolved into something deeper, a sound that vibrated in his chest and spoke of terror beyond anything the dog had ever experienced. Caleb had heard that tone only once before, during his tour in Vietnam, when his unit had discovered a village where something terrible had happened, something that had driven even the rats and insects away. "Easy." "Boy," Caleb called, but his own voice sounded thin and unconvincing. "We're getting out of here." But as he took a step back from the contaminated circle, the identification tag in his hand began to pulse with a heat that bordered on pain. The metal was responding to something, resonating like a tuning fork struck by an invisible hammer. And in that resonance, Caleb heard something that made his blood freeze. His name, not spoken aloud, not whispered by any voice he could identify, but communicated directly into his consciousness as if the corrupted metal itself was calling to him. The tag was more than just identification. It was a link, a connection to something that had been waiting patiently for his return. The memories came flooding back then, unstoppable as an avalanche. Project Deepwood hadn't been about logging at all, despite the company's cover story. Mountain Creek Timber had been contracted by a Defense Department subsidiary to dispose of experimental materials in remote locations where they'd never be found. Chemical compounds that were too dangerous for conventional storage. Biological agents that existed in legal gray areas. Waste products from research that officially didn't exist. Caleb had been told the materials were inert, neutralized, safe for burial in the deep wilderness where they'd never threaten anyone. He'd supervised the excavation of disposal sites in valleys so remote they didn't have names, locations accessible only by helicopter or days of hiking through terrain that would challenge an experienced mountaineer. The pay had been extraordinary, enough to secure his and Martha's future, enough to justify the secrecy and the vague unease that had settled over him during those years. But looking at the spreading contamination around the deer's carcass, Caleb realized he'd been lied to. The materials hadn't been inert at all. They'd been dormant, waiting, changing slowly over the decades until they were ready to emerge. And now they were reaching out, calling to the man who'd helped bury them in the first place. The identification tag was becoming too hot to hold. But when Caleb tried to drop it, the metal seemed to stick to his palm, as if magnetized to his flesh. The symbols beneath the Mountain Creek designation were glowing now, faint but visible. And they were moving, shifting and changing like living things. Buck's howl echoed through the forest, a sound of pure anguish that spoke of loyalty warring with instincts that screamed for flight. The dog was torn between his need to stay close to Caleb and his desperate desire to flee whatever was awakening in the contaminated circle. The forest around them had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no whisper of wind through the pine needles. Even the normal settling sounds of the woods, the creak of branches, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, had ceased entirely. It was as if the very wilderness was holding its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from the growing darkness. Caleb forced himself to look directly at the spreading contamination, though every instinct screamed at him to turn away. The dark substance was no longer random in its movement. It was forming patterns, shapes that resembled the layouts of the disposal sites he'd helped create 30 years ago. A map of buried sins rendered in corrupted matter, showing him locations he'd tried to forget, and in the center of each mapped site, a small concentration of the dark substance was rising, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. Not human, Caleb was certain of that, but something that had learned to mimic human form through long observation. Something that had been watching from the buried chemicals, learning, growing, preparing for this moment. The shapes were reaching toward him, their movements sluggish but purposeful. They knew him, recognized him as the man who'd placed them in their underground prisons. And now they wanted something from him, payment for years of confinement, compensation for the isolation and darkness they'd endured. The identification tag finally released its grip on his palm, dropping to the forest floor with a metallic ring that seemed impossibly loud in the unnatural silence. Where it had touched his skin, a mark remained. Not a burn exactly, but a discoloration that pulsed with the same rhythm as his heartbeat. Buck's loyalty finally overcame his terror, and the dog bounded toward Caleb, placing himself between his master and the emerging shapes. The German shepherd's hackles were raised to their full extent, his teeth bared in a snarl that spoke of readiness to die, defending the man who'd cared for him since puppyhood. "No, Buck!" Caleb shouted, grabbing the dog's collar before he could charge into the contaminated area. "We're leaving. Now." But as they turned to flee, Caleb caught a glimpse of something that stopped him cold. In the largest of the rising shapes, features were becoming visible. A face that was almost human, but wrong in ways that made his vision blur. And in that face he saw recognition. Not just knowledge of who he was, but awareness of what he'd done, understanding of the choices he'd made and the consequences he'd tried to avoid. The thing spoke without vocal cords, its words forming directly in Caleb's mind with a clarity that was worse than any voice. "We remember, Caleb Rowen. We remember everything. And now it's time to come home." The forest exploded back into sound as Caleb and Buck ran, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush as they fled toward the cabin. Behind them, the unnatural silence deepened, spreading outward from the contaminated circle like a wave of wrongness that would soon cover everything Caleb had ever loved. His past had found him at last, and it was hungry for more than just recognition. It wanted payment in full for 30 years of buried guilt, and it wouldn't stop until it had collected every ounce of what he owed. Caleb didn't remember the run back to the cabin, only Buck's urgent breathing beside him and the burn in his lungs as they crashed through familiar trails that suddenly felt foreign and threatening. His 70-year-old body wasn't built for running anymore, and by the time they reached the clearing around his home, his chest felt like it might explode, and his legs trembled with exhaustion. Buck reached the porch first, turning to watch the forest line with his ears pricked forward and his tail rigid. The dog's behavior had shifted from terror to protective alertness, as if whatever had frightened him in the contaminated clearing was now something he needed to guard against. Caleb fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking not just from exertion, but from the memory of that voice speaking directly into his mind. Inside the cabin, he collapsed into Martha's old rocking chair, the one she'd used for reading in the evenings while he worked on equipment maintenance or planning the next day's activities. The familiar creak of the wood and the lingering scent of her lavender soap should have been comforting. But tonight, they only emphasized how alone he was with whatever was happening in the forest. Sleep was impossible. Every time Caleb closed his eyes, he saw those dark shapes rising from the contaminated ground, felt the burning touch of the identification tag against his palm. The mark it had left was still visible, a discoloration roughly the size of a quarter that pulsed faintly in rhythm with his heartbeat. He'd scrubbed at it with soap and water, even tried rubbing it with salt. But the mark remained stubbornly visible. Buck refused to settle in his usual spot by the fireplace, instead positioning himself by the front door, where he could watch both the windows and the entrance. The dog's vigilance was absolute, his dark eyes moving constantly between potential points of intrusion. When Caleb tried to coax him away from his post with treats, Buck merely glanced at the offered food before returning his attention to his self-appointed guard duty. At 3 in the morning, Caleb gave up on sleep and made coffee, his hands steadier now, but his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in disaster. The Project Deepwood materials hadn't been inert, as promised. They'd been changing, evolving, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. And somehow they remembered him, knew his name, his face, his role in their burial. The rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible. Chemicals didn't develop consciousness. Waste materials didn't form memories or hold grudges. But the mark on his palm pulsed with undeniable reality. And Buck's continued vigilance suggested that whatever they'd encountered was far from finished with them. As dawn approached, Caleb found himself drawn to Martha's old hope chest, a piece of furniture he'd avoided touching since her death. Inside, beneath carefully folded quilts and photo albums, he knew she'd kept important papers, insurance documents, property deeds, and personal items she'd considered too precious for everyday storage. His hands trembled as he lifted the heavy lid, releasing the scent of cedar and the faint perfume that had always been uniquely Martha's. The quilts were still perfectly folded, made by her grandmother and saved for special occasions that had never quite seemed special enough. Beneath them, wrapped in tissue paper, were photographs from their early years together, their wedding, the construction of the cabin, holidays with friends who had long since moved away or passed on. But it was at the bottom of the chest that Caleb found what he was looking for without realizing he'd been searching for it. A manila envelope, thick with papers and marked in Martha's careful handwriting, Caleb's work things. Important. Inside were documents he'd never seen before, though they bore his name and signature on every page. Employment contracts with Mountain Creek Timber that included clauses about special projects and confidentiality agreements. Insurance forms covering hazardous material handling, medical waivers that absolved the company of liability for long-term health effects from exposure to experimental substances. And at the bottom of the stack, a photograph that made his blood run cold. The image was partially burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it but hadn't completed the job. It showed 3 men standing beside a deep excavation in a remote forest clearing. Caleb recognized himself immediately, 35 years younger, but wearing the same serious expression he'd carried through those troubled years. Beside him stood his immediate supervisor, a company man named Richard Voss, who'd always seemed to know more than he was willing to share. But it was the 3rd man who made Caleb's hands shake as he held the photograph. The face was mostly obscured by burn damage, but enough remained to trigger a flood of unwelcome memories. Dr. Marcus Webb, the government liaison who'd overseen the disposal operations with the cold efficiency of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. Webb had been the one to assure Caleb that the buried materials posed no long-term threat, that the remote locations would keep them safely isolated from human contact. Looking at the photograph now, Caleb realized that Webb's assurances had been lies. The doctor had known exactly what they were burying, had understood the potential for the materials to change and evolve over time. Project Deepwood hadn't been a disposal operation at all. It had been a long-term experiment with the wilderness as a laboratory and Caleb as an unwitting test subject. Martha had known. Somehow she'd discovered the truth about his work and had kept these documents hidden, waiting for the day when he might need them. The realization brought tears to his eyes, not just grief for her loss, but gratitude for her continued protection even after death. Buck's low growl interrupted his reading, and Caleb looked up to see the dog standing rigid by the window that faced the forest. Outside, the morning light revealed something that made his heart pound with renewed fear. The trees at the edge of the clearing were wrong, not dead or diseased, but changed in ways that hurt to look at directly. The bark seemed to move slightly, flowing like water frozen mid-cascade. The leaves rustled without wind, their surfaces reflecting light in patterns that suggested the presence of something that didn't belong in any natural forest. And at the base of several trees, dark stains were spreading through the soil, creeping toward the cabin with the patience of something that had waited decades and could wait decades more. The contamination was spreading, following his scent trail back from the deer carcass to his home. Whatever intelligence guided the corrupted material, it had learned enough about human behavior to understand that Caleb would return to the place he felt safest. Now it was coming for him, bringing its hunger for payment and its memories of burial in the dark earth. Caleb gathered the documents from Martha's envelope, stuffing them into a waterproof bag along with what few supplies he could carry quickly. The cabin had been his sanctuary for 35 years, but it was about to become a trap. He needed distance, time to think, and most importantly, he needed to warn others about what was emerging from the buried disposal sites. But first, he had to call Pete Granger. His old friend deserved to know that something dangerous was loose in the mountains, even if Caleb couldn't explain the full truth without sounding completely insane. Pete had lived in these woods long enough to recognize when something was fundamentally wrong with the natural order. As he reached for the phone, Buck's growling intensified, and through the window, Caleb saw the first of the dark shapes emerging from the tree line. They moved with the deliberate patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run, flowing across the ground like oil given form and purpose. The things that had once been buried, chemicals were coming home, and they intended to collect everything Caleb owed them, including his life. The phone rang 3 times before Pete Granger's gravelly voice answered, thick with sleep and confusion. "Caleb, what's wrong?" "It's barely 7 in the morning." "Pete, I need you to listen carefully," Caleb said, watching through the window as the dark shapes moved closer to his cabin. "There's something dangerous in the woods. You need to stay inside today, keep your doors locked, and don't go anywhere near the upper trails." "Dangerous how? You talking about that mountain lion Sarah mentioned seeing tracks of last week?" Caleb struggled to find words that wouldn't make him sound like a man losing his grip on reality. "Not a mountain lion. Something else. Chemical contamination, maybe. Just promise me you'll stay put until I can get down there and explain properly." Pete's voice sharpened with concern. "Caleb, you sound rattled. What happened up there?" Before Caleb could answer, the sound of tires on gravel announced an unexpected visitor. Through the front window, he saw Sarah Granger's familiar green pickup truck pulling into his driveway, the early morning sun glinting off her windshield. She climbed out with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission, carrying what looked like a canvas bag of supplies. "Sarah's here," Caleb told Pete, relief flooding through him. "I'll bring her with me when I come down to explain. Just stay inside, okay? You're scaring me, old friend." "But I'll do as you ask." Caleb hung up and hurried to open the door before Sarah could knock. She looked up at him with those sharp green eyes that missed nothing, her expression shifting from friendly greeting to concern as she took in his appearance. "You look terrible," she said without preamble. "When's the last time you slept? Or shaved, for that matter?" "Sarah, you can't be here," Caleb said, glancing past her toward the tree line where the dark shapes had paused their advance, as if waiting to see what this new development might bring. "It's not safe." "Not safe how?" Sarah's scientific training kicked in immediately, her gaze following his toward the forest. "I came up here because Grandpa called last night. Said you'd seemed off when he talked to you yesterday, worried about you being alone too much. But you're really spooked about something, aren't you?" Caleb found himself caught between the desperate need to protect her and the equally desperate need for someone with her expertise to help him understand what was happening. Sarah had a doctorate in environmental science, had spent years studying the effects of industrial contamination on wilderness ecosystems. If anyone could make sense of what he'd discovered, it would be her. "Come inside," he said finally. "But stay away from the windows and be ready to leave quickly if I tell you to." Sarah raised an eyebrow, but followed him into the cabin, where Buck immediately approached her for the gentle ear scratching she always provided. The dog's tail wagged briefly, but his attention remained divided between his affection for Sarah and his vigilant watch over the windows. "Even Buck seems on edge," Sarah observed, settling into Martha's rocking chair while keeping her eyes on Caleb. "What's going on? And don't tell me it's nothing. I've known you too long to buy that." Caleb pulled out the waterproof bag containing Martha's documents and the burned photograph. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to look at these papers first and tell me what you make of them." Sarah's expression grew more serious as she examined the documents, her scientific mind processing the information with the thoroughness that had made her reputation in environmental circles. The employment contracts, the hazardous material waivers, the insurance forms, all of it painted a picture that clearly troubled her. "This is from Mountain Creek Timber?" she asked, looking up from a particularly dense legal document. "But these aren't logging contracts. This is hazardous waste disposal, and it's all classified under some kind of military designation. Project Deepwood," Caleb confirmed. "I was told the materials were inert, neutralized, safe for burial in remote locations where they'd never pose a threat to anyone." Sarah's face had gone pale as she continued reading. "Caleb, some of these chemical designations, I recognize them from my graduate research. These aren't inert materials. They're experimental compounds that were banned from testing after preliminary studies showed they could cause genetic mutations in organisms exposed to them." "How bad?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Bad enough that the Environmental Protection Agency classified them as weapons of mass destruction," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These chemicals don't just contaminate, they change things at a molecular level, create new forms of life that shouldn't be able to exist. The research was shut down in the 1980s because even the most aggressive military scientists considered it too dangerous to pursue." She looked up at him with growing alarm. "How much of this material did you help bury? And where?" Caleb pulled out the burned photograph, his hands trembling as he handed it to her. "Dozens of sites across the Bitterroot Range, maybe more. I supervised the excavations, but I was never told the full scope of the operation." Sarah stared at the partially destroyed image, her scientific objectivity warring with the horror of what she was beginning to understand. "This third man, the one whose face is burned away, do you know who he was?" "Dr. Marcus Webb, government liaison. He assured me the materials were safe, that the burial sites would contain them indefinitely." Caleb's voice was bitter with the weight of 30 years of guilt. "I believed him because I wanted to believe him. The money was too good to turn down, and Martha and I were planning our future." "Marcus Webb," Sarah repeated, and something in her tone made Caleb look at her sharply. "You know that name?" "I know of him. My dissertation advisor mentioned him. Once," said Webb, "had been involved in some of the most unethical environmental experiments in U.S. history before disappearing." From public records in the late 1980s, Sarah set down the photograph with shaking hands. "Caleb, I think you were part of something much bigger than waste disposal. I think you were unknowingly facilitating the creation of biological weapons." Through the window, the dark shapes had resumed their advance, flowing across the ground with increasing speed. Whatever patience they'd shown was wearing thin, and Caleb could sense their growing hunger for confrontation. "There's more," he said, pulling up his sleeve to show her the mark on his palm. "Yesterday, Buck and I found a deer with a massive growth. When I cut it open, there was an identification tag from Mountain Creek timber inside, along with some kind of living contamination. It burned this mark into my hand, and then it spoke to me." Sarah stared at the pulsing discoloration, her scientific skepticism battling with the evidence before her eyes. "That's impossible. Chemicals don't develop consciousness." "These did," Caleb said grimly. "They know my name, Sarah. They remember being buried, and they want payment for 30 years of imprisonment." "We need to get you to a hospital," Sarah said, standing abruptly. "That mark could be spreading some kind of infection. And if the contamination is as dangerous as these documents suggest..." Buck's sharp bark cut her off, and they both turned toward the window to see the first of the dark shapes reaching the edge of the cabin's foundation. The thing flowed like oil, but held a roughly humanoid form, and where it touched the wooden structure, the logs began to change, their surfaces rippling and darkening as if the very material was being corrupted at a molecular level. "Too late for hospitals," Caleb said, grabbing his rifle and the bag of documents. "We need to get to your truck and get off this mountain. Now!" But as they moved toward the door, more shapes emerged from the forest, surrounding the cabin with the methodical precision of a military operation. The things that had once been buried chemicals had learned patience during their decades of imprisonment, and they weren't going to let their primary target escape without a fight. "Sarah," Caleb said quietly, checking his rifle's action, "I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to build a good life with Martha." "I know," Sarah replied, pulling out her cell phone to call for help only to find no signal. "But right now, we need to focus on getting out of this alive so you can help me figure out how to stop it from spreading." Outside, the dark shapes pressed closer to the cabin, and the wood continued to change under their touch, becoming something that belonged neither to the forest nor to any world where humans were meant to survive. The dark shapes surrounding the cabin moved with deliberate purpose, but they seemed content to wait rather than attack immediately. Caleb watched through the kitchen window as one of the entities touched the corner of his woodshed, and the entire structure began to transform, the weathered pine boards rippling like water before hardening into something that looked more like black metal than wood. "They're not just contaminating," Sarah whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. "They're converting organic matter into something else entirely. This is beyond any known chemical process." Buck positioned himself between Sarah and the front door, his hackles raised, but his growling more controlled now. The dog seemed to understand that panic would serve no purpose. They needed strategy, not fear. "How long until they decide waiting isn't worth it?" Sarah asked, pulling equipment from her canvas bag. Caleb was surprised to see that she'd brought what looked like scientific instruments, a handheld spectrometer, a digital pH meter, and something that resembled a Geiger counter, but with additional sensors. "You came prepared for environmental testing," he observed. "I've been monitoring unusual readings in the watershed for the past 6 months, Sarah explained, assembling her equipment with practiced efficiency. Elevated heavy metal concentrations in streams that drain from the upper elevations, pH fluctuations that don't match any known geological processes. I was planning to ask you about possible contamination sources on the mountain." She activated the Geiger counter-like device, and immediately it began clicking rapidly, the digital display showing radiation levels that made her face go pale. "Caleb, this isn't just chemical contamination. Whatever's out there is putting out gamma radiation at levels that should be lethal to anything organic." "But we're not dead," Caleb pointed out. "No, we're not. Which means either the readings are wrong, or those things are somehow shielding us from the full effects. Sarah adjusted the device's settings, frowning at the results. Or they want us alive for something. The spectrometer readings were equally disturbing. Sarah's equipment detected chemical signatures that didn't match anything in her database, elements that seemed to exist in impossible combinations, molecular structures that defied the basic rules of chemistry she'd learned in graduate school. "I need to get closer to one of them," Sarah said, moving toward the window. "Absolutely not," Caleb replied, grabbing her arm. "Those things killed a full-grown deer just by growing inside it. I'm not letting you anywhere near them. Caleb, if this contamination spreads beyond the mountain, it could affect thousands of people. I need data to understand how it works, what its limitations are, how we might be able to stop it." Before Caleb could argue further, his landline phone rang. The sound was jarring in the unnatural silence that had settled over the forest. And for a moment both he and Sarah stared at it, as if it might be another manifestation of the corruption outside. "Should be Pete," Caleb said, answering cautiously. "Pete?" "Caleb, thank God." Pete's voice was tight with worry. "I've been trying to reach you for an hour. There's something you need to know about those documents Sarah found." "What do you mean?" "After you called this morning, I couldn't stop thinking about that name, Dr. Marcus Webb, so I made some calls to old friends, guys who worked construction and logging back in the day. Turns out Webb didn't disappear after the project ended." Caleb felt his stomach drop. "Where is he?" "That's the thing. Nobody knows for sure. But Tommy Rodriguez, who used to drive truck for Mountain Creek, swears he saw Webb in town about 6 months ago. Driving a government vehicle, meeting with people who looked like federal agents." Sarah grabbed Caleb's arm, her eyes wide. 6 months ago, that's when I started detecting the anomalous readings in the watershed." "Pete," Caleb said into the phone, "are you sure it was Webb?" "Tommy's sure," said the man. Looked older but unmistakable. Tall, thin, that dead-eyed stare that always made people uncomfortable. Webb was asking questions about the old logging roads, specifically the ones that led to the remote disposal sites. "Why would he come back after 30 years? Sarah asked. "Maybe he never left," Caleb realized with growing dread. "Maybe he's been monitoring the sites, waiting for them to activate." Pete's voice crackled through the phone with increasing urgency. "There's more." Tommy said Webb had equipment with him, sensors, monitoring devices. "Like he was tracking something, or waiting for something to emerge," Sarah whispered. Through the window, the dark shapes seemed to respond to their conversation, pressing closer to the cabin walls. Where they touched the foundation, the concrete began to change, developing a crystalline structure that pulsed with faint luminescence. "Pete, I need you to stay inside and keep your doors locked," Caleb said. "If anyone comes around asking about us or about the old logging operations, don't tell them anything." "Caleb, what aren't you telling me?" Before Caleb could answer, Sarah's radiation detector began screaming, not just clicking rapidly, but emitting a continuous alarm that filled the cabin with its urgent warning. The readings on the display were climbing beyond the device's ability to measure. "Something's changed," Sarah said, her voice tight with professional concern. "The radiation levels just spiked to 20 times what they were a minute ago." Outside, the dark shapes were no longer waiting. They flowed toward the cabin with sudden purpose, their forms becoming more defined and predatory. The largest of them had developed what could charitably be called a face, features that suggested intelligence, but arranged in ways that made Caleb's eyes water to look at directly. "We need to move," Caleb said, hanging up on Pete without explanation. "Back door now." But as they turned toward the rear of the cabin, Buck began barking frantically at the kitchen window. More shapes were emerging from the forest on that side, cutting off their escape route with the same methodical precision they'd shown in surrounding the front. "They're herding us," Sarah realized, "keeping us contained until—" Her words were cut off by a sound that neither of them had ever heard before, a low, harmonious humming that seemed to come from all the shapes at once. It wasn't quite music and wasn't quite machinery, but something in between that resonated in their bones and made their teeth ache. "They're communicating," Sarah whispered in amazement and horror. Those things are coordinating with each other. The humming grew louder, and Caleb felt the mark on his palm begin to burn again. But this time, the pain came with images, flashes of memory that weren't his own. Underground chambers filled with experimental equipment. Rows of sealed containers holding substances that moved of their own accord. And overseeing it all, Dr. Marcus Webb, taking notes with the detached interest of a scientist observing lab rats. "He's still alive," Caleb said, the certainty hitting him like a physical blow. "Webb is still alive, and he's been waiting for this to happen." "How can you know that?" "Because the things outside, they're showing me. They want me to understand that this isn't random, isn't an accident. Everything that's happening was planned 30 years ago." The cabin shook as one of the larger entities pressed against the wall, and the wood began its terrible transformation. Sarah grabbed her equipment bag in Caleb's hand, her scientific objectivity finally giving way to the reality of their situation. "If Webb planned this, then he knows how to control it," she said. "We need to find him. First, we need to survive the next 10 minutes, Caleb replied, checking his rifle again. "Those things aren't going to wait much longer." As if responding to his words, the humming outside rose to a crescendo, and the dark shapes began to merge, flowing together into something larger and more purposeful than anything the forest had ever contained. They were done being patient, done observing. It was time to collect what they believed Caleb owed them, and they intended to do it whether he was willing or not. The merged entity outside had grown to the size of a small truck, its form constantly shifting between liquid darkness and something that almost resembled living tissue. As it pressed against the cabin's walls, Caleb could hear the wood groaning under pressure that seemed to come from more than just physical force. The very molecular structure of his home was being rewritten by contact with the corrupted mass. "There has to be something we're missing," Sarah said, frantically reviewing the documents from Martha's envelope while her equipment continued its urgent warnings. Some weakness, some way to stop them. Buck had positioned himself at the exact center of the cabin, turning slowly to keep watch on all sides as the entities pressed closer. The dog's behavior had shifted again, less panicked now, more like a soldier accepting the inevitability of battle while remaining alert for any opportunity. "Wait," Sarah said suddenly, holding up one of the insurance documents. "Look at this clause about long-term exposure effects. It mentions genetic memory preservation as a potential side effect of the experimental compounds." "What does that mean?" Caleb asked, though he suspected the answer would be worse than he wanted to hear. "It means the chemicals don't just change organisms, they record information about them. DNA sequences, neural patterns, even memories." Sarah's face had gone completely pale. "Caleb, I think those things outside aren't just contamination. They're a record of everyone who was ever exposed to the buried materials, including the people who buried them." Caleb realized with growing horror. "That's why they know your name, why they remember being buried. They have access to your memories from when you handled the containers, breathed the air around the disposal sites." Sarah grabbed his arm with shaking hands. "If this is true, then they know everything you know, every location, every person involved, every detail about the project." The implications hit Caleb like a physical blow. If the entities had absorbed his memories, they would know about Pete, about Sarah, about every innocent person who might become a target. They would also know about Martha, about how much she'd meant to him, about his vulnerabilities and fears. The cabin shuddered again, and this time the sound of splintering wood accompanied the groaning. The entities weren't just pressing against the structure anymore. They were actively dissolving the barriers between themselves and their target. "We need to get to my truck," Sarah said, gathering her equipment. "If we can reach town, warn the authorities." "No good," Caleb interrupted, pointing toward the window. Sarah's pickup truck was surrounded by smaller entities that had flowed from the main mass, and the vehicle itself was beginning to show signs of the same molecular corruption that was affecting the cabin. The metal was becoming fluid, reshaping itself in ways that suggested the truck would never run again. Sarah stared at her transformed vehicle with the expression of someone watching their last hope disappear. "Then we're trapped." "Not yet," Caleb said, moving toward Martha's hope chest. "There's something else in here. Something Martha saved that I thought I'd never need again." He pushed aside the remaining quilts and photo albums, searching for something he'd buried as deeply as the toxic materials in the forest. At the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath a false bottom Martha had helped him construct, were items from a life he'd tried to forget, military medals, including a Purple Heart from Vietnam, service papers documenting tours of duty in places that officially didn't exist, and most importantly, a military radio, old but maintained, capable of reaching emergency frequencies that might still be monitored. "You were in the service," Sarah observed, watching him unwrap the radio with practiced efficiency. "2 tours in Vietnam, then some work afterward that I'm not supposed to talk about," Caleb replied, his fingers remembering the radio's operation despite decades of disuse. "Special operations behind enemy lines. I learned how to survive when everything goes wrong." The radio crackled to life, and Caleb began transmitting on a frequency he'd memorized 40 years ago and never forgotten. Broken Arrow, this is Ghost 7 requesting immediate assistance. Biological contamination event in progress, Bitterroot Range, Montana. Request hazmat team and military containment unit." The response came faster than he'd expected, confirming that someone was still monitoring the old emergency channels. "Ghost 7, identify yourself and nature of contamination. Caleb Rowen, former Mountain Creek Timber, Project Deepwood participant. Buried materials have activated and are showing hostile intelligence. Requesting immediate extraction and containment." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Caleb wondered if the transmission had been lost. "Then Ghost 7, stand by for priority routing. Project Deepwood assets are being mobilized." Sarah stared at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Project Deepwood assets? That sounds like they were expecting this." Because they were, Caleb realized with sick certainty. This whole thing, the disposal sites, the waiting, the activation, it was all part of the plan. "We weren't disposing of weapons, Sarah. We were planting them." The radio crackled again. "Ghost 7, your position is being tracked through your transmission. Military containment team en route, ETA 40 minutes. Maintain position and avoid direct contact with contaminated entities." "Copy that," Caleb replied, though he suspected 40 minutes might be longer than they had. The cabin walls were now visibly dissolving where the entities touched them, and the air inside was growing thick with an oily mist that made breathing difficult. Buck began barking again, but this time his attention was focused on something new. A sound approaching through the forest that was definitely mechanical rather than organic. The rumble of multiple vehicles moving fast over rough terrain, accompanied by the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors. "That's not 40 minutes, Sarah said, moving to the window despite the danger. Through the dissolving walls, they could see lights approaching through the trees. Not the soft glow of headlights, but the harsh white beams of military-grade illumination. The entities surrounding the cabin seemed to sense the approaching threat, their forms shifting from aggressive advance to defensive positioning. But it was what Sarah saw in her equipment that made her grab Caleb's arm with sudden urgency. The radiation readings, they're spiking again, but not from the entities. From whatever's coming through the forest. The radio burst to life with a new voice, one that made Caleb's blood run cold with recognition. "Ghost 7, this is Dr. Marcus Webb. I'm approaching your position with a containment team. Please maintain your current location. We have the situation under control." "Webb," Caleb whispered, and the mark on his palm began burning with renewed intensity. "Ghost 7, I want to assure you that your participation in Project Deepwood has been exemplary. The activation event you're experiencing was always part of the long-term strategy. You and the entities are both valuable assets that we intend to preserve." Sarah grabbed the radio from Caleb's hands. Dr. Webb, this is Dr. Sarah Granger, environmental scientist. These entities are putting out lethal levels of radiation and converting organic matter through unknown processes. They represent a clear and present danger to the entire ecosystem. Webb's response was calm, almost amused. Dr. Granger, I'm familiar with your work, monitoring our watershed test sites. Your data has been quite useful in tracking the activation timeline. I can assure you that the entities are operating within acceptable parameters. Acceptable to who? Sarah demanded. To the people who understand that evolution sometimes requires a guiding hand, Webb replied. The entities you're observing represent the next phase of Project Deepwood, biological weapons that can adapt, learn, and persist in any environment. 30 years of field testing has proven their viability. The approaching lights were now visible through the forest, and Caleb could see that Webb's containment team included vehicles that looked more like mobile laboratories than rescue units. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was a harvest. Caleb, Webb's voice continued through the radio, you've done excellent work as our unwitting field observer. Your emotional attachment to the test site has provided valuable data about how the entities respond to long-term human presence. Now it's time for the final phase of the experiment. What final phase? Caleb asked, though he was beginning to understand with horrible clarity. Integration, Webb replied. The entities have absorbed enough human genetic material and memory to begin the next phase of their development. They need a stable biological host to complete their evolution, someone with intimate knowledge of their creation and deep emotional ties to the test environment. Bucks. Barking had become a continuous alarm as the military vehicles broke through the tree line, their lights illuminating the transformed landscape around the cabin. The entities surrounding the building were no longer trying to break in. They were waiting, as if they knew that their true purpose was about to be fulfilled. You planned this, Sarah said into the radio, her voice shaking with anger. All of it, the disposal sites, the contamination, even bringing us together here. Dr. Granger, your grandfather Pete has been providing us with regular reports about Mr. Rowen's psychological state for the past 2 years. We needed to ensure he would be emotionally stable enough for the integration process. The betrayal hit Caleb like a physical blow. Pete, his oldest friend, had been watching him for Webb all along. The visits, the concerned phone calls, the gentle suggestions that Sarah check on him, all of it had been part of the experiment. The good news, Webb continued as his vehicle surrounded the dissolving cabin, is that the integration process should preserve most of your consciousness while allowing the entities to access your complete memory archives. You'll become something new, Mr. Rowen, the first successful hybrid between human intelligence and engineered biological weapon. Through the failing walls of his home, Caleb could see armed figures in hazmat suits taking positions around the cabin. They weren't here to rescue him. They were here to ensure he couldn't escape his appointment with a future he'd never asked for. But 30 years of mountain living and 4 decades of military training had taught Caleb that no situation was completely hopeless as long as a man still had the will to fight. And looking at Sarah's determined face, he realized he wasn't facing this final battle alone. The sound of helicopter rotors grew deafening as Webb's containment team established a perimeter around the dissolving cabin. Through the failing walls, Caleb could see figures in full hazmat gear moving with military precision, setting up equipment that looked more suited to a laboratory than a rescue operation. The entities had stopped their assault on the cabin entirely, seeming to understand that their work was about to be completed by human hands. Sarah frantically gathered her scientific equipment while Caleb checked his rifle, both of them knowing that conventional weapons would be useless against what they were facing. But the radio was still transmitting, and Webb's voice continued with the calm satisfaction of a man watching his life's work reach its culmination. Mr. Rowen, I want you to understand that your selection for the integration process wasn't random, Webb said. Your psychological profile, your emotional attachment to the test site, your physical resilience. All of it was evaluated during your original employment with Mountain Creek Timber. You've been planning this for 30 years? Sarah demanded into the radio. Longer than that, Dr. Granger. Project Deepwood began as a theoretical exercise in 1975, exploring the possibility of creating biological weapons that could adapt and evolve independently. The Mountain Creek disposal operation was our first field test, a chance to observe how the experimental compounds would develop in a natural environment. Caleb felt sick as the full scope of the deception became clear. Martha's cancer. Was that part of your experiment too? Webb's silence stretched long enough to provide its own answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried no trace of remorse. Mrs. Rowen's exposure to low-level contamination provided valuable data about the long-term effects of the compounds on human physiology. Her illness progression was carefully monitored, and her tissue samples after death contributed significantly to our understanding of the integration process. The words hit Caleb like physical blows. Martha hadn't died from random cancer. She'd been slowly poisoned by the very chemicals he'd helped bury. Her suffering, her death, her final months of pain had all been data points in Webb's monstrous experiment. "You killed her," Caleb whispered, and for the first time in decades, he felt the cold rage that had carried him through the worst firefights in Vietnam. Mrs. Rowen's sacrifice advanced our understanding of human entity compatibility by decades. Webb replied with clinical detachment. The data from her case study directly informed the protocol we're implementing today. Sarah grabbed Caleb's arm as she noticed something her equipment was detecting. The radiation signatures are changing again, but not from the entities. From the military equipment they're setting up outside. She held up her spectrometer, and Caleb could see readings that indicated massive energy buildup in the devices Webb's team was deploying around the cabin. Those aren't containment units, Sarah realized with growing horror. They're amplifiers. Very perceptive, Dr. Granger, Webb's voice confirmed. The integration process requires significant energy input to break down the barriers between human consciousness and entity collective memory. The equipment you're detecting will facilitate the merger by creating a controlled electromagnetic field. You're going to force the integration, whether Caleb consents or not, Sarah said. Consent is irrelevant at this stage. Mr. Rowen became a volunteer the moment he signed his original employment contract with Mountain Creek Timber. The legal language was quite specific about participation in long-term research projects. Caleb was barely listening to Webb's explanations, his mind racing through possibilities for escape or resistance. The cabin was surrounded, his truck destroyed, and the entities were clearly working with rather than against Webb's team. But his military training had taught him that every operation had vulnerabilities, and 30 years of mountain living had shown him that knowledge of local terrain could overcome superior numbers and equipment. "Sarah," he said quietly, "how long do those amplifiers need to charge up?" She checked her readings. "Based on the energy accumulation rate, maybe 10 minutes. Then we have 10 minutes to get out of here." Caleb moved to the back of the cabin, where Martha's root cellar provided access to a tunnel they dug during the first winter as emergency storage. The tunnel extended about 50 yards into the forest, emerging in a depression that would be hidden from Webb's perimeter. But as they prepared to enter the tunnel, Webb's voice crackled through the radio with an announcement that changed everything. "Mr. Rowen, there's something else you should know about Project Deepwood, something that will help you understand why your cooperation is essential. Nothing you say is going to change my mind about becoming part of your sick experiment," Caleb replied. "Even if I told you that the entities aren't the only product of our research, that Mrs. Rowen's consciousness was preserved during the integration process, and she's been waiting 30 years for you to join her." The words stopped Caleb cold, his hand frozen on the tunnel entrance. "That's impossible. The entities don't just absorb genetic material and memories, Mr. Rowen. They preserve complete consciousness patterns. Your wife's personality, her memories, her love for you, all of it was recorded during her final exposure to the compounds. She's been part of the collective consciousness since her death, waiting for the day when you could be reunited. Sarah grabbed his arm, her face urgent with concern. Caleb, he's lying. That's not how consciousness works. You can't preserve a personality in chemical compounds, but even as she spoke, one of the entities outside began to change, its formless mass taking on a shape that made Caleb's heart nearly stop. The figure was indistinct but unmistakably feminine, moving with a grace that he recognized even through the corruption of its unnatural form. "Martha?" he whispered, and the entity responded by pressing closer to the cabin wall, its form becoming more defined with each passing moment. "She's been calling to you through the mark on your palm," Webb explained. "The burning sensation you've experienced, that was Mrs. Rowen trying to communicate, trying to guide you toward reunion. The entities brought you here not for punishment, but for love." The shaped entity outside had developed features now, eyes that held intelligence and recognition, a stance that spoke of patience rewarded. And despite the wrongness of its form, despite the corruption that had twisted it into something that shouldn't exist, Caleb could see Martha in its movements. "This is psychological warfare," Sarah said urgently. "He's using your grief against you, showing you what you want to see." But the entity that claimed to be Martha was reaching toward the cabin wall, and where its hand touched the dissolving wood, words began to form in script that Caleb recognized, Martha's careful handwriting. The same script that had labeled the envelope containing his secret documents. "My dearest Caleb," the words read, "I've been waiting so long to tell you that I understand why you made the choices you did. Come to me and we can be together forever, unchanged by time or death." The message was so perfectly Martha, her voice, her way of understanding and forgiving, her ability to see past his mistakes to the man she'd fallen in love with. And despite everything he knew about Webb's manipulation, despite Sarah's warnings and his own rational mind, Caleb felt himself drawn toward the entity that wore his wife's shape. 10 minutes, Mr. Rowen," Webb's voice continued. "In 10 minutes, the amplifiers will be ready, and the integration will begin, whether you participate willingly or not. But if you come outside now, if you accept the reunion that Mrs. Rowen has been waiting 30 years to offer, the process will be gentle, loving, a true joining rather than a forced merger." The mark on Caleb's palm was burning again. But this time the pain felt different, not like injury, but like the ache of old scar tissue responding to changes in weather. And in that burning, he could swear he felt Martha's touch, her hand reaching across 30 years of separation to guide him home. "Caleb," Sarah said desperately, "please don't do this. Whatever that thing is, it's not your wife. It's a weapon that's learned to mimic her, to use your love against you." But the entity outside had begun to hum, not the discordant sound the others had made, but a melody Caleb recognized. Martha's favorite song, the one she'd hummed while cooking dinner or working in her garden. A simple tune that had been the soundtrack to the happiest years of his life. And despite every rational thought in his head, despite the warnings of the woman who was trying to save him, Caleb found himself moving toward the door, drawn by the promise of ending 30 years of loneliness and guilt in the arms of the woman who had been his whole world. The integration process was about to begin, and for the first time since discovering the contaminated deer, Caleb wasn't sure he wanted to resist it. Caleb's hand was on the door handle, the metal warm under his palm, as the entity outside continued its haunting melody. But Sarah's desperate voice cut through the emotional fog that threatened to overwhelm his judgment. "Caleb, look at me," she said, grabbing his face and forcing him to meet her eyes. "I know what you're feeling. I know how much you miss her. But that thing outside isn't Martha. It's using her memory to manipulate you into becoming part of Webb's weapon." The rational part of Caleb's mind knew she was right. 30 years of mountain solitude had taught him to trust his instincts, and every survival instinct he possessed was screaming warnings about the entity outside. But the emotional wound of Martha's loss was deeper than rationality, deeper than fear, deeper than the will to live. What if it really is her? He whispered. What if she's been trapped in that collective consciousness, waiting for me to join her? Then we find another way to free her, Sarah replied, with fierce determination. But we don't hand ourselves over to Webb's experiment on the chance that his promises are true. Buck padded over to Caleb. The dog's warm presence, an anchor to reality in the swirling chaos of emotional manipulation. The German shepherd looked up at his master with dark eyes that held absolute trust. Trust that Caleb would make the right choice. Trust that 30 years of loyalty and companionship meant something. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice wasn't Webb's. Caleb, can you hear me? The words were distorted, filtered through layers of electronic interference, but the tone was unmistakably Pete Granger's. Sarah grabbed the radio. Pete, where are you? About 2 miles out with a convoy of federal agents, Pete's voice replied, heavy with shame and urgency. Caleb, I need you to know that I never intended for things to go this far. Webb told me he was monitoring environmental health, keeping track of contamination that might affect the watershed. I thought I was helping protect the community. How long have you been reporting on me? Caleb asked, his voice flat with betrayal. 2 years, since Martha died. Webb said the grief might make you unstable, might cause you to do something that would expose the old disposal sites. He convinced me that keeping an eye on you was protecting everyone. The amplifiers outside were humming now, building toward the energy levels needed for forced integration. Through the dissolving cabin walls, Caleb could see Webb's technicians making final adjustments to equipment that looked more like instruments of torture than scientific devices. Pete, what kind of federal agents? Sarah asked urgently. EPA, FBI, and some military units I don't recognize. They're moving fast, but Webb's people have about a 5-minute head start. Caleb felt a spark of hope for the first time since the siege began. If legitimate federal authorities were approaching, Webb might be forced to abandon his integration, timeline or risk exposure of project. Deepwood to agencies that weren't under his control, but the entity outside seemed to sense the approaching threat to its reunion with Caleb. The Martha-shaped form pressed harder against the cabin wall, its features becoming more distinct and desperate. The handwriting on the dissolving wood changed, becoming more urgent. Please, Caleb, I can't hold this form much longer. Webb's equipment is forcing me back into the collective. This may be our only chance. It's accelerating the process, Sarah observed, checking her equipment. The energy readings are spiking beyond what the amplifiers should be capable of producing. Something else is powering the integration attempt. Caleb moved away from the door, his military training finally overriding his emotional impulses. If Martha's consciousness really was trapped in the collective, then becoming part of it wouldn't free her. It would just add his awareness to whatever prison Webb had created for the preserved minds of his victims. He opened the wooden chest containing his military gear, pulling out items he'd hoped never to use again. The Purple Heart medal felt heavy in his palm, not from its physical weight, but from the memories it carried, memories of a younger man who'd learned to fight against impossible odds and survive when everyone said survival was impossible. Sarah, I need you to understand something, Caleb said, strapping on the combat harness he hadn't worn in 40 years. What I'm about to do might not get us both out of here alive. What are you planning? She asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. Webb's equipment needs power to force the integration. If I can destroy the amplifiers, it might disrupt the process long enough for the federal agents to arrive. Caleb checked the action on his rifle, muscle memory guiding movements that had kept him alive in jungle firefights decades ago. But those amplifiers are heavily guarded, and getting close enough to sabotage them means going through. Webb's containment team, you're talking about a suicide mission. I'm talking about doing what should have been done 30 years ago, stopping Webb before he can hurt anyone else. Caleb looked toward the entity outside, its Martha-shaped form still reaching toward him with desperate longing. If that really is Martha in there, then she'd understand. She always knew that some things were worth dying for. Buck whined softly, sensing the shift in his master's demeanor. The dog had lived through enough hunting seasons to recognize when Caleb was preparing for something dangerous, and his alert posture suggested readiness to follow wherever his human led. "I'm going with you," Sarah said, gathering her equipment into a compact pack. "Absolutely not. You're a scientist, not a soldier. I'm the only person here who understands how Webb's equipment works," Sarah replied with calm determination. "You can get us close to the amplifiers, but I'm the one who knows which components to target for maximum disruption." The radio crackled again, this time with Webb's voice carrying new urgency. "Mr. Rowen, the federal convoy approaching your position is not here to rescue you. They're here to contain the situation by eliminating all witnesses to Project Deepwood's existence. Your cooperation with the integration process is the only way to ensure Dr. Granger's survival." "He's lying," Sarah said immediately. "The EPA doesn't execute civilians to maintain secrecy," but Caleb wasn't so sure. His black operations experience had taught him that government agencies were capable of extraordinary measures when national security was at stake. If Project Deepwood was classified at the highest levels, the approaching agents might indeed have orders to sanitize the situation completely. The amplifiers outside reached full power with a sound like reality tearing at its seams. The entity claiming to be Martha began to glow with unnatural light, its form becoming more solid and defined as the forced integration process prepared to begin. "Time's up," Webb announced over the radio. "Mr. Rowen, step outside now, or we begin forced extraction." Caleb made his choice with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Vietnam and a dozen classified operations afterward. He activated the old emergency beacon hidden in his military gear, a device that would broadcast his location and situation to any military units monitoring the tactical frequencies. "Sarah, when I give the signal, you run for the tunnel. Don't look back, don't try to help me. Just get to those federal agents and tell them everything you know about Project Deepwood." "What about you?" Caleb shouldered his rifle and moved toward the front door, Buck falling into position beside him with the loyalty of a soldier who'd followed orders into hell before. "I'm going to give Webb something he didn't plan for, a target that shoots back." The mark on his palm was burning like fire now. The Martha entity outside, calling to him with increasing desperation as the amplifiers prepared to tear his consciousness from his body, whether he participated willingly or not. But the purple heart in his pocket was a reminder of who he'd been before Project Deepwood, before the guilt and secrets and 30 years of hiding, from the consequences of choices made by a younger man who trusted the wrong people. He was about to find out if that younger man's skills had survived the decades of mountain solitude, and whether love was stronger than the weapons of war that men like Webb created in the darkness between conscience and ambition. Caleb threw open the cabin door and stepped into a world transformed by 30 years of buried nightmares. The amplifiers Webb's team had positioned around the clearing hummed with energy that made the air itself feel thick and wrong, like breathing through oil. The Martha entity turned toward him with desperate hope, its form more solid now, more convincingly human, reaching out with hands that almost looked real enough to touch. "Caleb," Sarah's voice called from behind him, but he was already moving, muscle memory from Vietnam taking over as he identified targets and cover positions with the cold efficiency of a man who'd learned to kill or be killed in environments where hesitation meant death. The first technician never saw him coming. Caleb's rifle butt connected with the man's helmet with enough force to drop him silently, and Caleb was already moving toward the next target before the body hit the ground. The hazmat suits Webb's team wore might protect them from biological contamination, but they did nothing against a 70-year-old man who'd spent 40 years learning exactly how to disable threats quickly and quietly. Buck bounded alongside him, the dog's hunting instincts adapting perfectly to this new prey. When a technician turned toward Caleb's position, Buck hit him low, knocking the man off balance long enough for Caleb to deliver a blow that put him down permanently. Hostile in the perimeter, someone shouted over the radio, and suddenly the clearing erupted with activity as Webb's security team realized their carefully controlled environment had become a combat zone. Caleb dove behind one of the amplifiers as automatic weapons fire erupted around him, the massive device providing cover while he assessed the tactical situation. There were at least a dozen armed personnel in hazmat gear, positioned around equipment that looked more like a laboratory than a field operation. But they were scientists and technicians, not soldiers, and their movements showed the kind of hesitation that got people killed in real firefights. The Martha entity was calling to him, its voice somehow audible over the gunfire and chaos. "Caleb, please. The integration field is tearing me apart. I can't maintain this form much longer." But Sarah's desperate shout cut through the emotional manipulation. "The amplifiers are resonating with each other. If you can destroy the primary unit, it should cascade through the entire network." Caleb spotted the primary amplifier, a device twice the size of the others, positioned at the center of the clearing and surrounded by cables that connected it to every other piece of equipment. Getting to it would mean crossing 30 yards of open ground under fire from opponents who, despite their lack of military training, still had superior numbers and automatic weapons. The emergency beacon in his military harness was broadcasting his situation on tactical frequencies, but he had no idea if anyone was listening or how long it would take for help to arrive. The federal agents Pete had mentioned were still minutes away at best, and the forced integration process was accelerating as the amplifiers reached critical resonance. "Ghost 7, this is Falcon Command," a voice crackled through his military radio. "We have your position and are tracking multiple unknown aircraft in your vicinity. Military response teams are en route, ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours. The integration field was already affecting his thinking, making it harder to focus on tactical considerations as memories that weren't his own began bleeding into his consciousness. He could see flashes of the collective awareness the entities shared, decades of buried existence. The slow accumulation of consciousness from every organism that had come into contact with the contaminated sites and threaded through it all, like a golden thread in a tapestry of darkness. He could sense something that might truly be Martha, not the shaped entity calling to him, but a deeper presence woven into the collective memory of Project Deepwood's victims. Contact left. Buck's warning bark snapped Caleb back to immediate reality as 3 of Webb's security team flanked around the amplifier he was using for cover. The dog launched himself at the lead figure while Caleb rolled right, his rifle coming up to engage targets that were close enough to touch. The firefight was brief and brutal. 40 years of muscle memory guided Caleb's movements as he neutralized the threat with the kind of violence that had kept him alive in jungles where the enemy could be anyone and anything. But the exertion was taking its toll on his 70-year-old body, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs with dangerous intensity. Sarah appeared at his side, carrying her scientific equipment and a flare gun she'd found in the cabin's emergency supplies. "I've identified the resonance frequency they're using," she said, breathing hard from her sprint across the clearing. "If I can get close enough to inject a counter-frequency into the primary amplifier, it should create a feedback loop that destroys the entire network." "How close?" Caleb asked, reloading his rifle while scanning for the next wave of threats. "Close enough to touch it. The field they're generating would interfere with any remote signal." Caleb looked across the open ground between their position and the primary amplifier. Webb's remaining security team had taken defensive positions around the device, and the Martha entity was standing directly beside it, her form flickering between solid and translucent as the integration field fluctuated. "That's a suicide run," he said bluntly. "Not if you provide covering fire," Sarah replied. checking the settings on her equipment. I just need 30 seconds to plant the device and activate the counter frequency. Webb's voice echoed across the clearing through external speakers. Calm despite the chaos around him. Mr. Rowen, you're only delaying the inevitable. The integration process has already begun. You can feel it, can't you? The collective consciousness reaching out, drawing you in. Soon you won't be able to distinguish between your memories and theirs. It was true. The longer Caleb stayed in the integration field, the harder it became to maintain his individual identity. He could feel other minds pressing against his consciousness, not just Martha, but dozens of others who had been absorbed by the entities over the decades. Workers who had been exposed during the original disposal operations. Animals that had wandered into contaminated areas. Even some of Webb's own researchers who had gotten too close to their experiments. The beautiful thing about consciousness, Webb continued, is that it's essentially information. And information can be preserved, copied, shared. Your wife understood that in her final moments, she chose to become part of something larger, rather than simply dying and disappearing forever. The Martha entity was crying now, tears that sparkled with unnatural light streaming down her almost human face. "Please, Caleb," she called. "I'm losing myself in the collective. If you don't come to me now, I'll be dissolved back into the mass consciousness. This will be our last chance." Buck whined softly, his instincts torn between loyalty to Caleb and terror of the unnatural forces surrounding them. The dog's hackles were raised, but he remained at his master's side, ready to follow whatever decision Caleb made. "Sarah," Caleb said quietly, "when I start shooting, you run for that amplifier and you don't stop for anything. Not even if I go down." "Caleb, promise me," he interrupted. "Whatever happens to me, you stop this thing before it spreads beyond the mountain." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "What about Martha? If she really is trapped in there, then the kindest thing we can do is set her free," Caleb replied, though the words felt like tearing his heart out. "Martha would never want to be part of something that hurts innocent people, even if it meant we could be together again." He rose from cover, his rifle ready, the Purple Heart in his pocket, a reminder of who he'd been before Project Deepwood corrupted everything he'd tried to build with Martha. The integration field pulled at his consciousness, promising reunion and peace. But 40 years of mountain solitude had taught him that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. "Now!" he shouted, and opened fire on Webb's security team while Sarah sprinted toward the primary amplifier with the device that might save them all, or might get them both killed in the attempt. Sarah ran through gunfire like a woman possessed, her scientific equipment clutched against her chest while bullets whined past her head. Caleb's covering fire was precise and deadly, each shot dropping one of Webb's security team with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd learned to kill in places where mercy was a luxury that got good people dead. But the integration field was affecting him more with each passing second. Foreign memories bled into his consciousness. The terror of animals caught in contaminated zones. The confusion of researchers who'd realized too late what they'd become part of. And threading through it all, a presence that felt achingly familiar. Martha. Not the entity calling to him from beside the amplifier, but something deeper in the collective consciousness, a core of identity that had somehow remained intact through 30 years of absorption and integration. She was there, buried in the mass of accumulated minds, and she was trying to tell him something not like this. Her voice whispered in his mind, clearer than it had been since her death. "This isn't love, Caleb, this is prison. Don't let him trap you too." Buck's agonized howl cut through the gunfire, and Caleb turned to see one of Webb's technicians raising a weapon toward the dog. Without thinking, Caleb threw himself between Buck and the threat, feeling the impact of the bullet as it tore through his shoulder and spun him around. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but it also had an unexpected effect. The physical trauma seemed to disrupt the integration field's hold on his consciousness, giving him a moment of clarity in the midst of the psychic chaos. Sarah reached the primary amplifier and immediately began connecting her counter-frequency device to the main power coupling. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was doing, but Caleb could see more of Webb's team moving to intercept her. 30 seconds. She shouted over the noise of the failing amplifier network. Caleb fired at the approaching threats despite the fire in his shoulder, but his accuracy was suffering from blood loss and the disorienting effects of the integration field. One of his shots went wide, and a security team member got close enough to Sarah to grab her arm. That's when Buck made his final, greatest act of loyalty. The German Shepherd launched himself at Sarah's attacker with a fury that spoke of 13 years of absolute devotion to the humans he'd sworn to protect. The man's scream was cut short as Buck's teeth found his throat, but the dog's momentum carried him directly into the path of another technician's weapon. The shot that killed Buck echoed across the clearing like the sound of something irreplaceable breaking forever. The dog's body hit the ground hard, his dark eyes finding Caleb's for one last moment before the light went out of them. Buck! Caleb's roar was part grief, part rage, and entirely focused on the man who'd killed his oldest friend. The rifle in his hands became an extension of his fury as he advanced on the technician. Ignoring the bullets that buzzed around him like angry wasps, the integration field pulsed with his emotional state. And suddenly Caleb could feel every consciousness trapped within the collective, their fear, their longing for freedom, their desperate hope that someone would finally end their imprisonment. Even Martha's presence seemed to strengthen, as if his grief had somehow amplified their connection. "Save them," her voice urged him. "All of them." In this, Sarah's device was working. The primary amplifier began to shriek with feedback as her counter-frequency created the cascade failure she'd predicted. One by one, the other amplifiers around the clearing started to overload, their harmonious humming turning into discordant wailing that hurt to hear. Webb's voice crackled over the radio, no longer calm but edged with desperation. "All units, stop the woman! The cascade failure will destroy 30 years of research." But it was too late. The feedback loop Sarah had created was unstoppable, racing through the connected network of amplifiers like a virus through a computer system. The integration field began to collapse, and with it, the carefully maintained barriers that had kept the collective consciousness stable. The Martha entity beside the primary amplifier began to scream, not with her voice, but with the voices of everyone trapped within the collective. Dozens of minds suddenly freed from their psychic prison, confused and terrified and desperate to escape the dissolution of their shared identity. "The containment is failing," one of Webb's technicians shouted. "If the entities lose cohesion, they'll disperse into the groundwater system." Caleb realized with sick certainty what that meant. Instead of being contained in a single location, the contamination would spread through the entire watershed, affecting every community downstream from the mountain. Webb's experiment would go from a localized horror to a regional catastrophe. The Martha entity was changing, her form becoming less stable as the collective consciousness began to fragment. But in her eyes, Caleb could see recognition, not the desperate hunger of something trying to complete an integration, but the grateful acknowledgement of someone who understood that freedom was more important than preservation. "I love you," she mouthed, the words barely visible through the static discharge surrounding her failing form. "I always loved you. Now let me go." Sarah's flare gun appeared in her hands, Martha's old emergency signaling device that had waited decades for its moment of purpose. Without hesitation, she aimed it at the overloading primary amplifier and fired. The flare struck the amplifier's power core just as the cascade failure reached critical mass. The explosion that followed wasn't just physical but psychic, a release of accumulated consciousness that lit up the night sky like a aurora made of human souls finally finding peace. The shockwave knocked Caleb to his knees, but through the ringing in his ears, he could hear something beautiful. Voices calling out in joy and relief as decades of trapped minds found their way to whatever came after death. Martha's voice was among them, no longer distorted by the collective, but clear and pure and free. "Thank you," she whispered. And then she was gone, not absorbed back into some artificial construct, but genuinely, finally at rest. The amplifiers were dead, their twisted metal cooling in the mountain air. The entities that had emerged from the contaminated burial sites were dissolving, their unnatural cohesion broken by the collapse of the integration field. And across the clearing, Webb's remaining team was surrendering to the federal agents who had finally arrived to contain a situation that was already resolving itself. Caleb crawled to where Buck lay still in the grass, his faithful companion's sacrifice having saved not just Sarah, but potentially thousands of people downstream from the mountain. The dog's collar was still warm under his hands, and for a moment, Caleb could almost pretend that Buck was just sleeping after a long day of hunting. But the sound of approaching helicopters reminded him that this particular hunt was over, and it was time to face whatever consequences came from 30 years of buried secrets finally clawing their way into the light. 6 months later, Caleb sat on the rebuilt porch of his cabin, watching Sarah direct the environmental remediation teams that had been working the mountain since the night Project Deepwood finally died. The federal investigation had been thorough and devastating. Webb and his surviving team faced charges ranging from illegal human experimentation to conspiracy to commit genocide. The buried disposal sites were being excavated and properly contained, their contents destined for facilities that actually understood what they were handling. The mark on Caleb's palm had faded to a barely visible scar, no longer pulsing with unnatural heat. The shoulder wound from that final firefight had healed well enough, though it ached when the weather changed, a reminder that he was alive when he might easily have been dead or worse. Buck's grave was marked by a simple stone Sarah had helped him carve, positioned where the old dog could watch over the clearing that had been his territory for 13 years. Sometimes Caleb caught himself listening for the familiar sound of claws on the wooden porch, or glancing toward the door, expecting to see Buck's patient eyes waiting for the next adventure. "The water tests are finally coming back clean," Sarah said, climbing the porch steps with a folder full of scientific reports. "No trace of contamination in any of the downstream communities. Whatever process you and Buck triggered that night, it seems to have neutralized the active compounds completely." Caleb nodded, though he suspected the explanation was more complex than simple neutralization. In the quiet moments between sleep and waking, he sometimes sensed something in the mountain air, not the hungry presence of trapped consciousness, but something peaceful and protective, as if the souls that had been freed were standing guard against future corruption. "Pete stopped by while you were walking the perimeter," Sarah continued. "He wanted you to know that his testimony helped the prosecutors understand the full scope of Webb's manipulation." Apparently, Webb had been running similar observation programs in 6 other states, using local contacts to monitor potential test subjects. The betrayal still stung, but Caleb had found it easier to forgive Pete's unwitting participation than to carry the weight of anger alongside everything else he'd endured. Pete had been manipulated just as thoroughly as everyone else in Webb's web of deception, and his guilt was punishment enough for an old man who'd thought he was protecting his community. "Any word on the other sites?" Caleb asked, all contained or neutralized. "The FBI task force has been working around the clock to locate every disposal site from the original Project Deepwood documents." Sarah sat beside him in Martha's old rocking chair, which she'd claimed during the long months of cleanup and investigation. "It looks like your site was the only one that achieved full activation. The others were still dormant when the containment teams reached them." Caleb wondered if that was coincidence, or if something about this particular mountain, something about his presence here, his grief, his guilt, had been necessary to trigger the awakening process. Webb's notes, recovered from his mobile laboratory, suggested that emotional resonance played a crucial role in activating the experimental compounds. The entities had needed someone who carried the weight of their burial, someone whose memories they could access and use to understand the world they'd been excluded from. A small movement at the edge of the clearing caught his attention, and Caleb smiled for the first time in days. A young German shepherd puppy emerged from the tree line, tail wagging as it bounded toward the porch with the kind of fearless enthusiasm that only came with youth and ignorance of danger. "She's beautiful," Sarah said, watching the puppy investigate the scents around Buck's grave with serious concentration. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Caleb had resisted the idea of a new dog for months, insisting that Buck was irreplaceable and that his heart wasn't ready for the vulnerability that came with loving something that would inevitably die before he did. But Sarah had been persistent, arguing that the mountain was too quiet without the sound of a dog's presence, that Caleb needed something to care for beyond his own. Guilt and grief. The puppy bounded up the porch steps and immediately began investigating Caleb's boots with the thorough attention of a creature determined to understand this new person through scent and texture. When she looked up at him with dark eyes that held echoes of Buck's intelligence, Caleb felt something in his chest loosen for the first time since that terrible night. "What are you going to call her?" Sarah asked. Caleb reached down to scratch behind the puppy's ears, remembering Martha's gentle hands performing the same gesture for Buck during their first meeting 13 years ago. "Hope," he said quietly. "Her name is Hope." The puppy's tail wagged harder at the sound of her new name, and she immediately claimed the spot on the porch where Buck used to lie, as if she understood that she was inheriting not just a home, but a legacy of loyalty and protection. "The EPA wants to establish a permanent monitoring station here," Sarah said, pulling out another folder. "They're offering to hire you as a consultant. Given your knowledge of the original disposal operations and your familiarity with the terrain, that would mean staying," Caleb observed. "Is that a problem?" Caleb looked out across the clearing where Martha's garden had once grown, where Buck had chased rabbits and squirrels, where the final battle against Project Deepwood had been fought and won. For 30 years, this place had been his sanctuary from the consequences of choices made by a younger man. Now it could become something different, not a hiding place, but a guard post, a position from which to ensure that nothing like Webb's experiment ever threatened innocent people again. "No," he said finally. "It's not a problem." Hope curled up against his feet, already claiming him as her own, with the possessive affection that came naturally to her breed. In the distance, Caleb could hear the sound of the remediation teams packing up their equipment, their work finally complete. The mountain was clean again, its streams running clear, its soil free from the corruption that had festered in the darkness for 3 decades. But more than that, Caleb was clean too. The guilt that had driven him to this remote cabin was finally laid to rest, alongside the souls he'd helped free from their psychic prison. Martha's forgiveness, spoken through the collective consciousness in those final moments, had lifted a weight he'd carried for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. As the sun set behind the peaks of the Bitterroot Range, Caleb rocked gently in his chair, one hand resting on Hope's warm fur, while Sarah reviewed reports that would help prevent future environmental disasters. The quiet was no longer the silence of isolation, but the peace of purpose. The contentment that came from knowing that some fights were worth winning regardless of their cost. In the growing darkness, he could almost feel Martha's presence, not trapped or desperate, but free and watching over the place they'd built together. Buck's spirit seemed to join her, the two of them standing guard over a mountain that had seen too much death, but had finally found its way back to life. Hope's collar jingled softly as she adjusted her position, a small sound that spoke of beginnings rather than endings, of love that persisted beyond loss, of hope that bloomed even in soil that had been poisoned by the worst impulses of human ambition. The mountain was safe. The people downstream were protected. And for the first time in 30 years, Caleb Rowen was truly home.